In 19th century Italy, the leading woman in an opera or theater company was known as the prima donna, literally the first lady. This woman, usually the principal soprano of the company, would typically perform the leading roles and generally sing more music than other women in the company. At times, these prima donnae had grand offstage personalities, and they made strict demands on fellow troupe members, musicians, set and wardrobe designers, producers, etc. However, they were deferentially tolerated because of their consummate talent and their draw at the box office. Over time, the term prima donna came to mean anyone who behaves in a demanding, temperamental fashion, revealing their inflated view of themselves and their self-importance. Bitcoin has certainly had its fair share of prima donnas.
This podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as financial advice. All views expressed on this podcast are solely the opinions of the host and/or any guests that we might have from time to time. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as a specific inducement to make a particular investment or to follow a particular investing strategy.
Hello, you sexy sat stackers, and welcome to episode 215 of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. This is a makeup episode because I was extremely sick on Wednesday. However, fear not, as always, I did make our weekly DCA purchase, even though I couldn't manage to croak out an episode. If you follow us on Twitter, or X, you already knew this. And of course, if you don't follow us on Twitter, please take a moment to do so, as it is the easiest and fastest thing you can do to help support the podcast and to spread the word. On X, we are at BTC Bulletin Pod, BTC like the abbreviation for Bitcoin, Bulletin, and of course Pod for podcast, at BTC Bulletin Pod. I am recording from home today once again because I'm still a little under the weather, so please forgive me if my voice gives out or if I have to pause for a coughing fit. I've already had to do so and start completely over just a few minutes ago, but I will do my best. We also recently adopted a young German Shepherd puppy, and she is just a little fur missile, a complete ball of energy. So if you hear a dog bark occasionally, that is another occupational hazard that I may have to contend with today. Not to mention the parrots who like interrupting from time to time. But first thing is first. Of course, Bitcoin is back over the 100,000 US dollar mark, and I don't want to toot my own horn, but if you're a regular listener to the podcast, you've heard me say repeatedly things like, every previous cycle has 5 to 7 corrections during the bull run that were at least as big as this one, or this is not what a blow-off top looks like, usually in response to people saying the bull run's already over, etc. Of course, if history repeats or rhymes, we won't see the face-melting price increase until later this summer or even early fall. And finally, last but not least, this cycle feels a heck of a lot like it did in 2017. Of course, that is still true. Turda Meester hinted at this, even if it was just an accident. I don't know if that's the point he was trying to make, but it's the point I got when he retweeted a post that he had made on January 1st of 2017. That post said, Bitcoin breaks 1,000 US dollars on Bitfinex. Happy New Year, everyone. Of course, if you weren't here in 2017, Bitcoin broke the $1,000 mark for the first time around January of 2017, and then basically floundered. It pulled back a little bit and kind of went sideways until about May of 2017 when it started gently coasting up. And then, of course, by the end of the summer, the end of August, Bitcoin had breached 4,000 US dollars per Bitcoin, and then the arc increased as Bitcoin went on that parabolic bull run, peaking at just about 20,000 US dollars in December of 2017 before the Bitcoin winter began, and Bitcoin dropped all the way down to around 3,000 US dollars before the next halving, and rinse and repeat. Of course, on Wednesday, when I made our DCA Wednesday stack, Bitcoin was flirting with 100,000 US dollars. Wasn't quite there, and we managed to stack just under that. We purchased at a then price of 98,955 US dollars. Of course, with the fees that every exchange charges either fees or a spread or some combination of the two, because they're businesses and they have to make money. And with those fees, our average purchase price was over $100,000. And so our 20 US dollars got us an additional 19,756 Satoshis. That brought our total stack up to 10,655,961 Satoshis, which of course is worth more than $10,655 at the time of recording, despite the fact that we have only converted 3,960 US dollars as of the time of this recording into Bitcoin. And that purchase did increase our average cost basis by about $119. So our average cost basis is now $37,162.30, but still less than half. I mean, significantly less than half, almost a third of what Bitcoin's current price is. So where are we today? This is an abbreviated episode, or at least it's supposed to be, so I'm not going to go over all of the statistics that I normally go over, but let's take a really quick look at the basics. Of course, let's timestamp this episode. At the time of this recording, right now, we are sitting at a block height of 896,161, and Bitcoin is ringing in at 103,200 US dollars, which means if we were to stack today, not including fees and spread, we would receive only 969 Satoshis for every US dollar that we converted into Bitcoin. And that's the occupational hazard. That's that catch-22 of stacking in Bitcoin. As you watch the US dollar value go up, you feel really good because the fiat value of your stack is increasing. Maybe, people start to, the no-coiners, the doubters, even if you can't get them orange-pilled, start to actually acknowledge that, wow, you made a good choice, or at least, hey, look at you, you got really lucky. I heard from one of my no-coiner friends the other day, when he texted me and said, wow, Bitcoin really likes the Trump negotiating with England over tariffs. And I still haven't been able to orange pill him. And he's one of my friends that certainly doesn't need Bitcoin. He's got a reasonably comfortable life. And so I've always found that not necessarily the older, it doesn't really matter what age, but people who have a nice stock portfolio or a good income, they live in a nice house, drive a nice car, they're never really worried about money. They're more blind to fiat ripping them off, to the fact that their money's getting debased. They don't really see the need, the urgency that the average person sees, when they're struggling to maybe build a life, struggling to, if you're a Zoomer, just graduated from high school or college, or thinking about when you graduate from high school or college that it's going to be hard for you to build a life, as expensive as everything is, with wages not keeping up with inflation, etc. But when you're not in that boat, it's harder to grasp why. And this brings me back to one of the older Andreas Antonopoulos videos. I don't remember which lecture it was, but I think it was from 2016. And he was talking about how when he goes to places like Argentina, he never has to explain to people why they should adopt Bitcoin, only how do you adopt Bitcoin. And then when he gives speeches in the United States, of course, you remember the one infamous video clip. You might not even know it's Andreas, but it's the clip of the person up at the front of the room talking to like a mostly empty room, and one guy actually gets up and walks out. That's Andreas, and that's what the sort of thing he was dealing with in the United States, where he had to convince people why they needed Bitcoin, and it was harder for people who were comfortable to see that. And in the United States, when we had a stronger US dollar, when a stronger economy, when in general Americans were wealthier than the average person in the world, it was harder for Americans to see that. And even amongst Americans, it's harder for the wealthiest Americans to see it. Although, that's changing. And sometimes maybe it's just because numbers go up, and other times it's because inflation has been worse than normal these last few years. But I digress. So we get happy, we get excited when we see the fiat value of our stack go up. But it also means that it's going to be harder to stack those sats, that we're going to get fewer sats for our fiat. So it's just the nature of the beast. And right now, if you were to stack sats, you were only going to receive 969 sats for every dollar you convert. But Bitcoin's current US dollar value puts us back over that 2 trillion market cap, currently ringing in at 2.05 trillion US dollars. I know that's really important to corporate and institutional adoption. Wall Street likes to see large market capitalizations if it's a serious asset. If they're going to treat it as a serious asset, that's one of the things they like to look at. And of course, for those of you who value wealth in gold, it's even more expensive to purchase Bitcoin now because it will currently cost you 31 ounces of gold to purchase just one Bitcoin, just shy of 2 pounds of gold. And that's even with gold setting all-time record highs in relation to fiat. Of course, gold is a commodity, and just like the cost of eggs and toilet paper and everything gets more expensive as inflation devalues the value, eats away at the value of the US dollar, the value of fiat. And so, of course, that applies to gold as well. Some of, if not all of that gain that the gold bugs are seeing is simply, inflation rearing its ugly head in terms of the number of yellow coins you can stack for your fiat. All right. On to the news. Probably for the first time in a long time, the major news, at least the biggest, most argue about news on crypto Twitter, etc., is not the price. Even though the price is above 100,000 US dollars again, the price is booming. We're only 5 or 6% off of the all-time high. The big news continues to be op return. Now, I talked about this already in previous episodes, and there really isn't much more for me to add. The sides have pretty much been chosen. And it certainly appears that the core devs have drawn a line in the sand and they're doubling down. They're going to ram this removing the op return limit through in the next Bitcoin core release, regardless, come hell or high water. So if you disagree, even if you don't care about op return, but you don't like the way the core devs are handling it, the fact that they're flat out saying Bitcoin is not a democracy, we're the core devs, we get to do what we want, and that's not what consensus means, well, it is what consensus means, and there is something you can do about it. Remember, if you run a node, you are Bitcoin. Jameson Lopp is not Bitcoin. Influencers are not Bitcoin. The core devs are not Bitcoin. If you don't run a node, you should. And not just because of this kerfuffle, but this kerfuffle certainly highlights why you should be running a node. But if you do, you can make your voice heard by simply switching from Bitcoin Core to knots, for example. And even if you're not technical, let's say you run an Umbral node. I have an Umbral node. I love my Umbral node. I know a lot of people consider that not really running a node, but I use my node for certain things, and it's just a lot easier to have a package like Umbral where I have a little Raspberry Pi running behind my computer desk, and I have my Umbral node on it. I link my wallet for Donnas when I'm using Nostr is connected through that Umbral node. I run a Nostr relay to back up all my Nostr posts in case, my Nostr posts get deleted somehow off of other relays. There are just a lot of reasons why I like Umbral. But if you do run Umbral and you don't know how to run knots, well, it's easy. Just search for knots in the App Store, and it's just a matter of clicking on knots and installing knots. Of course, even if you don't want to run knots, let's say you don't trust knots for whatever reason, it's as simple as just don't upgrade. You don't have to upgrade to the latest edition of Bitcoin. It's often recommended that you wait a while before you do updates anyway, just to avoid accidentally stumbling into a bug that might not have been discovered yet. So it's not uncommon to run previous episodes of Core. I'm running 28 instead of 29.1 or whatever the current edition of Core is. So it's just a matter of just don't upgrade. And I certainly will not be upgrading Core. I'm going to be running knots on an old laptop. I'm going to continue to run Core on my Umbral just because I have a lot of other things synced with that node, and it's just easier for me to not do so. But the nice thing about Bitcoin is that unless we have a hard fork, it's always Bitcoin. Bitcoin is always backwards compatible, which means you can run an old version, and that will prevent you from being forced to run a version that removes the op return limit in this case, or any other quote unquote upgrade to Bitcoin that you disagree with. So along those lines, it's important to realize that there will always be bad actors in the world, and that includes Bitcoin. Sometimes they're the wolf in sheep's clothing trying to profit from pretending to be a Bitcoin, or even pretending to be a Bitcoin maxi, only to find out they're not really. And we saw that a few years ago with forgive me, my mind is wandering. As Stephen Wright said in the 80s, one time my mind wandered all the way to Venus and ordered a meal it couldn't pay for. But, Trace Mayer, he was the hodler of last resort. He brought to us Proof of Keys Day. He's famous for the Mayer multiple. And then he went around, it was Tone Vase's Unconfiscatable conference in Las Vegas, handing out little slips of paper trying to get people to buy Mimble coin or whatever it was. And that was his fall from grace. He reared his head at one of Michael Saylor's events not too long ago, but he's never apologized. And obviously, trust is one of those things that, you can burst onto the scene as an influencer, and maybe it takes a little while to build up a following, to build up a reputation, but man, you can destroy it in one instance. And we've seen that time and time again. It isn't just Trace Mayer. We've had all those rage quits in Bitcoin. But it's not unusual to have grifters. And Bitcoin, there's people out there that see dollar signs in their eyes when they see Bitcoin. They don't see a new global currency. They don't see making war unaffordable. They don't see, democratizing Wall Street. They see dollar signs, and they see you as their exit liquidity, just like in the shitcoin world. And so there's nothing unique about Bitcoin that will change the human nature of people with evil in their hearts. But sometimes it's just people that, they were good people, but they just let things go to their head. And maybe that's the case with the core developers. I've often said that I thought it was a bad idea to pay core devs. And we have these foundations that were giving grants to make it to where these core devs, it could be their full-time job. And so it's understandable that you've got this very small group of people. Again, human nature tends to be cliquey. I'm sure you've seen this at school or at work or in the world in general. And in this case, in a small group, especially when they wield absolute power, the old saying, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And while Bitcoin usually brings out the best in us, some things are just ingrained in human nature. And so maybe this is one of those cases. But along those lines, and this is a little bit of a tangent, doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Opportun. Well, it kind of does, but along those lines, I've probably mentioned numerous times that you usually won't find me at Bitcoin conferences. I don't usually attend Bitcoin conferences. You might find me at a local meetup from time to time, but there are many reasons for this. And the biggest one actually has always been that you could stack a lot of Bitcoin for what it costs to go to these conferences. A few years ago during the bear market, when Bitcoin was down around $3,000, you could easily spend that going to a conference, especially in a place like Miami, where you're going to spend $1,000 just on your hotel room for the week, probably more. The tickets can cost you $1,000, and just the whole concept of blowing several $1,000s. In fact, we've only converted $3,600 or around $4,000 of the Bitcoin in this podcast, less than that in many cases, because we stack just $20 a week. But when we're stacking just $20 a week, it's hard to comprehend blowing $3,000 or $4,000 to go to a conference. But I'm also extremely skeptical of the host of these Bitcoin conferences, Bitcoin Magazine, specifically their intentions with Bitcoin. And remember what I said about human nature and wolves in sheep clothing. Now, I only have anecdotal evidence of this for the most part, and a lot of it is just that bad feeling you get when you're around some people. And oftentimes you look back and you're like, man, I really should have trusted my instincts. They always say, trust your gut. But remember when they put the Taproot Wizards on stage in Miami? And then in a few days, they're going to put Peter Schiff on stage in Las Vegas. They've proven to be on the wrong side of Bitcoiners, on the things that Bitcoiners hold dear on just one too many occasions. And just things like parading the Taproot Wizards on stage, or Peter Schiff, who has not had a change of heart unless he's going to announce it in Las Vegas. And based on his recent tweets, I don't think that's the case. I think this is just another example of Bitcoin Magazine just not aligning with the incentives of the average Bitcoiner. And it keeps getting worse. On Thursday, Hodlerado on Twitter called them out, retweeting a post from Bitcoin Magazine opinion editor Shinobi. Hodlerado saying, "This is the opinion editor at Bitcoin Mag," and retweeting where Shinobi says, "Bitcoiners are such trash." Just one of many examples of Bitcoin Magazine being on the wrong side of our values. And why would I spend $3,000 or $4,000 to go to Las Vegas to give that money to Bitcoin Magazine, to make Bitcoin Magazine rich, to reward their business model, when I could just stack Bitcoin. Certainly, I don't have as much Bitcoin as I would like to have. I have a goal. I'm not really going to get into that goal. It's a floating goal anyway. Every time I've achieved my stacking goals, you set a new one. But my stacking goal does not involve taking $3,000 and giving it to Bitcoin Magazine. Don't worry, though. As always, we will win. This will pass. As I like to say, time wounds all heals. Eventually the scammers, the wolves in sheep clothing, will be exposed. And Bitcoin really doesn't care. TikTok next block, it will continue on its path to hyper-Bitcoinization and will eventually change the world for the better. It already has. It will continue to do so. And speaking of marching on, adoption keeps marching on. If you have a Steak and Shake restaurant near you, or close enough that it's worth the pilgrimage, I highly encourage you to make sure you get to a Steak and Shake location on Friday. And that is because, if you haven't heard, Steak and Shake tweeted out just 2 days ago from their official Twitter or X account, Steak and Shake accepting Bitcoin payments at all locations starting May 16th, making the cryptocurrency available to our more than 100 million customers. This movement is just beginning, and they signed it Steak-toshi. Of course, Steak and Shake made headlines by switching their fries back from vegetable oil, which is really seed oil, there's no vegetables in vegetable oil, to beef tallow. I know there's purists who say, well, those fries are manufactured off-site, and there may be seed oils still in the French fries before they get dumped in the beef tallow. But hey, they're trying. And the fact that they're going to start accepting Bitcoin, plebs, if this is important to you, it's important that you support these merchants so that they realize this was a great decision. Not just because in the future that Bitcoin will be worth more than the steak burger that you exchanged it for. Pardon me. There's that coughing fit. I can't hope that wasn't too loud. Not just because Bitcoin will be worth more, because that's a long-term thing. When people first stack their first sats, you don't realize the benefit of Bitcoin 10xing, 20xing, 100xing, because it's not going to do that right away. Maybe if your timing is really good and you get in right at the bottom, you see it relatively soon. But for Steak and Shake, what they're going to notice is how many people come into their restaurants and pay with Bitcoin, whether they see a spike in sales, etc. Later, they will realize the benefits if they hold that Bitcoin goes up in value, and now all of a sudden, instead of losing money to inflation, they're gaining money. But to make this successful, they're going to have to see Bitcoiners go to Steak and Shake and pay with Bitcoin. And I know it's hard to part with your sats, and sometimes it's a pain in the tuchus to part with those sats because, you have a capital gains event you might be worried about. So what I will do, and I know there's purists out there who will have a problem with this, but I'm going to go to the Steak and Shake in Merritt Island, Florida on the 16th, this Friday, and I am going to buy myself a double steak burger with bacon combo with those beef tallow fries, and I'm going to whip out my phone. I'm going to open the Strike app, and the Strike app is going to take money from my debit card. It's going to take US dollars that I would have normally paid had I swiped my debit card through the cash register, and instead, it's going to immediately convert that to Satoshis for actually a relatively small fee. Strike is one of the cheapest ways to buy or send Bitcoin. Steak and Shake's going to get Bitcoin. They're not going to know that I paid with US dollars. All they're going to see is that I ordered, that I paid in Bitcoin. I'm not going to have a capital gains event because I didn't actually touch Bitcoin for that transaction. And they're going to get Bitcoin. So win-win. And if you have a problem with that, you need to see the big picture here. Speaking of crypto adoption, this is kind of interesting. Conor McGregor, the famous MMA fighter, tweeted just last night, "Crypto, in its origin, was founded to give power back to the people. An Irish Bitcoin strategic reserve will give power to the people's money. I will be co-hosting a Twitter space to talk about what I want to see changed. Victory to Ireland." So you have Conor McGregor promoting a strategic Bitcoin reserve for Ireland, whether or not he will have any influence. He's certainly, very popular there. He's an influencer, an opinion influencer, so maybe it will help. But what this is more importantly is this is just a sign of the times of increasing adoption, and that adoption is going to include both corporate FOMO and nation state FOMO. And I cut Conor McGregor a lot of slack for using the C word here, as I do Steak and Shake. Pardon me. I do it myself from time to time. Although in my case, it didn't used to be a bad word in the early days. When I first got into Bitcoin, we called it crypto. A lot of the old Bitcoin memes say crypto. A lot of the old Bitcoin songs say crypto. Bitcoin was a cryptocurrency, and there weren't 20 or 30 or 40,000 S coins out there just staining the reputation. We didn't make the distinction between there's Bitcoin and there's crypto. So not everybody is a maxi. Everybody has to start the rabbit hole journey somewhere. So I cut people slack for using the C word. I still do it from time to time as well. Although I try to be consciously aware of it, just because it is a bit taboo nowadays to say crypto instead of Bitcoin. And if you hear me say crypto, usually you know what I'm talking about. Also, in corporate FOMO news, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian, tweeted out a reference to Michael Saylor saying, just in, and this was 3 days ago now, just in, Strategy CEO predicts over 700 public companies will be buying Bitcoin by next year. Supply shock incoming. I firmly believe this is true, but what Pete Rizzo is referring to is that Michael Saylor, of course, the executive chairman of Strategy, which used to be MicroStrategy, hosted a Bitcoin for Corporations conference in Orlando, May 6th through 7th. And this is where he made those comments. He gave a couple of speeches, I guess, at this conference. Michael Saylor, always bullish. And that's not an unreasonable prediction. Really, 700 companies is not a whole lot. I mean, there's hundreds, thousands of companies out there, and 700 would just be the tip of the iceberg. But it's something that I firmly believe will happen. It's inevitable. It will happen eventually, whether it happens today, tomorrow, or whether it takes another 50 years. When we achieve hyper-Bitcoinization, even the companies that don't get it right now, that even the banks that are all about fiat, because they're the ones that benefit from the money printing. They're the ones, the quintillionaires, that benefit from inflation because they get the money before it has a chance to increase inflation, and they make the loans and they print the money, and so even they will come kicking and screaming to Bitcoin, even if it's just for the profit modem, but because they won't have a choice when we're all on a Bitcoin standard. Amid all the corporate and institutional adoption, it is easy to forget that we haven't even gotten the retail FOMO part of the bull run yet. Remember all the previous cycles, the big pump at the end was when they say, they used to say that don't take stock tips from your shoe shine boy or your cab driver, because that's when it's a bubble, is when everybody's talking about, hey, you should get in on the market. Similarly, that sort of thing happens with Bitcoin. It's an indicator when all the no-coiners are piling in a fervor, in full-on FOMO. That's usually an indicator that we're at the euphoria phase of the bull market, and that maybe we're getting ready to see that crypto winner, that Bitcoin winner. But we haven't gotten there yet. And of course, there is a lot more money on Wall Street than there is on Main Street. So, that's why we've seen the Bitcoin price run up even without a lot of additional Main Street adoption. But even so, we're kind of starting to see that nexus. Now, I just got done dogging on Bitcoin Magazine, but I'm going to quote one of their tweets anyway because it makes a point. And this is from May 1st, so more than a week ago now. But they say, just in, $1.5 trillion Morgan Stanley to offer Bitcoin and crypto trading to its E-Trade clients. So there you see an example of, a big Wall Street titan like Morgan Stanley, their affiliate E-Trade, which is, by the way, one of the more popular discount brokers. I have used E-Trade. I used E-Trade for years before Bitcoin existed to try and save for my future. I know a lot of people who do, and even if Morgan Stanley, even if E-Trade are only doing this because they see a way to make more money, because they see people want Bitcoin, they know their clients want Bitcoin, and so they want to profit off of it. That's that thing about how Bitcoin changes your incentives. They see US dollars, but they have to bend the knee to Bitcoin to profit from it. And even these big Wall Street titans will be bending the knee and are bending the knee. But in this case, they're bending a knee in a way that'll make it even easier for your grandma, for your normies, to buy Bitcoin, even if they're just doing so and leaving it on an exchange, which we know is a no-no. But you're not going to talk most boomers into going out and buying a cold card and taking self-custody. And at least if they're going to hold Bitcoin, they're holding it, in their if they can hold it in their main brokerage account where most of their retirement is, that's better than nothing. If if Morgan Stanley, if E-Trade were to go bust, they're losing their retirement, whether it's all in, Tesla stock, Kraft food stock, whatever they're invested in, ETFs. It doesn't matter. If they were to lose everything, if the bubble were to pop on Wall Street, the auto investing where people just go and they put the certain amount of their paycheck into these ETFs, whether they're up at all-time record highs or not. It's just this automatic deducted from your paycheck investing thing. If that bubble pops, and if it takes some of these brokers down with them, and I'm not forecasting what would happen, I'm just saying in a black swan worst case event, if you're worried about your grandma losing her Bitcoin on E-Trade, she probably is not all in on Bitcoin. She's probably going to lose the vast majority of her wealth in her stocks. So I'd cut her some slack if she has Bitcoin in her E-Trade account. Remember, all of this comes down to the fact that you are still early, both in terms of Bitcoin adoption and in terms of this bull run. So buckle up. In this bull run and in Bitcoin's future in general, the best is yet to come. I'm trying to keep this as abbreviated as possible, and I hope you have enjoyed this somewhat abbreviated episode and late episode. And I do apologize for that, but I'm reaching the end of my ability to talk here, and I don't want to cough too loudly in this microphone. I did need to make that makeup episode. So again, I apologize for getting this out late. Hopefully next DCA Wednesday, I'll be back in the studio with a healthy voice and full of energy to bring you an episode that I think is really the top of my game. But until then, and as usual, before I wrap up, if you enjoyed listening to this episode, I would like to ask you to do me a solid and give it a 5-star review or rating. However, each wherever you're listening to this podcast, it varies in how you can rate and review podcasts, but if you take the time to make sure you do leave a rating review, that's the biggest way to feed that algorithm monster, which means it'll be more likely for other people to see this podcast when they're searching for Bitcoin content to listen to. And who knows, maybe you'll help orange pill one of those people that thinks that they're too late or thinks that I only have $100 and so it's not really worth investing just $100 a week into Bitcoin. Maybe they'll see this podcast, see that we've been stacking just $20 a week, and they'll be like, wow, if they can do it, I can do it. Maybe you'll help orange pill something, and all it will have taken was just rating and reviewing this podcast. But as I mentioned, that goes a long way to boosting us in the search results. It's something you can do that takes just a second and doesn't cost you anything. You can also help feed that algorithm monster by following us on Twitter. I've already mentioned that on Twitter we are at BTC Bulletin Pod. We don't have a lot of followers on Twitter at BTC Bulletin Pod. If you're not following us, you would have known that I was sick and that this episode was going to come out late. I don't spam you with superfluous content. All I do is basically post updates about when we have episodes come out or when we're not going to have an episode come out, like in this case because I was sick. And every once in a while, I'll tweet 1 or 2 posts that I'm going to talk about in the podcast so you can follow along. You can see what I'm talking about. But more importantly, I love to hear from you. So if you do follow us on X, my DMs are open. They're open right now. So if you send me a DM and it's not a spam, I've been getting a lot of requests on email for people to appear on podcasts. And it's usually like, hi, I have this winning trade strategy. You can flip real estate or you can flip used cars or, this is your winning stock portfolio strategy. And it's a bot trying to spam out to see if they can promote themselves. And I don't necessarily get back to those. But if you're a pleb and you want to say hi, I do get back to you. And more importantly, I like to hear what people think about this podcast or just generally get an idea of who you are, because when I'm staring at a computer screen talking into a microphone, I'm just staring into a computer screen and talking to a microphone. But if you send me a DM, if you send me an email, if you send me a boost, I get the feeling of who you are. Obviously, I love to talk and I love to talk about Bitcoin, but knowing that you're out there listening, getting a general idea of who you are and that you appreciate this podcast is what makes it all worth it. So send me that DM, or if you don't use Twitter, send me an email. My email is bitcoinbulletin@protonmail.com. I have that open right now too in another window. That's at bitcoinbulletin@protonmail.com. I do read those emails. I do get back to you if you're a pleb saying hi. But of course, don't forget to join us next Wednesday, allegedly, as long as I'm better. This has been a doozy of an illness. It's swept my whole family. I've been sick for 2 weeks. It's just hit a lot harder than a lot of illnesses. I don't know what it is. I'm on a pretty heavy duty antibiotic because, it spread to my lungs, ended up with pneumonia basically. And, So it's been a doozy, but provided that I'm healthy next Wednesday, don't forget to join us as we continue our DCA journey together. But either way, don't forget to keep on stacking those sats, you sexy sat stackers.